Hi guys. Tonight, we're not talking about kings, castles, or great battles. We're talking about something much quieter. Something most people never think about, where ordinary people slept. In the medieval world, home was not a place of comfort. It wasn't bright. It wasn't clean. And very often, it wasn't even above the ground. For medieval peasants, survival mattered more than sunlight. Warmth mattered more than space. And safety mattered more than dignity across Europe. Thousands of families lived parcely or entire land aground. Not as a punishment, not as a secret, but because, for them, it made sense. Tonight, we're going to slow down and step into that world. A world of dirt floors, low ceilings, and walls carved directly from the earth. A world where darkness was normal, smoke never fully cleared, and life continued quietly beneath the surface. This isn't a story about heroes. It's a story about endurance. About how people adapted when the land above them offered very little mercy. So, get comfortable. Lower the volume if you need to. And let's take our time, because this is the story of why medieval people chose to live below the ground. A world where survival mattered more than comfort. In the medieval world, comfort was not something people expected from life. It was not promised, and it was rarely discussed. For most ordinary men and women, the idea of living comfortably warm rooms, clean air, quiet nights belonged to a distant fantasy that had little connection to daily reality. Life was shaped instead by a single, overriding concern: survival. Survival meant enduring long winters without enough fuel. It meant waking before dawn to work land that often gave little back. It meant accepting hunger as a familiar presence, not an emergency. In this world, people did not ask whether a home felt pleasant or inviting. They asked whether it kept the wind away, whether it trapped heat, and whether it might protect them through another season. The medieval peasant lived close to the edge of necessity. A poor harvest could mean hunger. A cold winter could mean death. Illness moved quietly and without explanation, taking the young and old alike. There were no safety nets, no emergency systems, and no guarantees. Every choice, where to live, how to build, what to endure, was measured against one question: would this increase the chances of making it through tomorrow? To modern eyes, this way of thinking can feel harsh. Today, homes are often designed around comfort first. Light, space, fresh air, and privacy are assumed to be basic needs. But in the medieval period, these ideas carried very little weight. A bright home that could not retain warmth was a liability. A spacious structure that required more fuel to heat could become a death sentence in winter. Survival demanded compromise, and comfort was almost always the first thing sacrificed. The land itself was unforgiving. Medieval Europe experienced long stretches of cold weather, heavy rains, and unpredictable seasons. Storms could flatten crops. Frost could destroy months of labor overnight. Roads turned into mud, making travel slow and dangerous. Villages were often isolated, especially in winter, when distance became an enemy rather than a measure of space. In such conditions, the environment shaped human behavior far more than personal preference ever could. Homes reflected this reality. They were not expressions of identity or taste. They were tools. Like a plow or a sickle, a house was expected to serve a practical function. If it failed to keep out the cold, or if it required constant repair, it was not doing its job. A home that felt unpleasant but worked was better than one that felt pleasant but failed when it mattered most. This practical mindset extended to every part of daily life. People wore heavy, rough clothing not because it was comfortable, but because it lasted. Meals were repetitive and plain, designed to provide energy rather than enjoyment. Days followed the rhythm of light and season, not personal desire. Even sleep was shaped by necessity, with entire families often sharing a single space to conserve warmth. Within this world, there was little room for complaint. Hardship was not viewed as exceptional. It was expected. Children grew up watching their parents endure physical exhaustion and discomfort without protest. From an early age, they learned that life was not meant to be easy. It was meant to be survived. This attitude did not make suffering disappear, but it did normalize it, embedding endurance deeply into everyday behavior. Religion reinforced this outlook. Many medieval people believed that hardship was a natural part of human existence, even a test of faith. Comfort, when it appeared, was temporary and often viewed with suspicion. Endurance, on the other hand, was virtuous. To suffer quietly, to persist without complaint, was seen as a sign of moral strength. This belief helped people accept living conditions that modern observers might find unbearable. It is important to understand that medieval peasants were not ignorant of better possibilities. They could see how the wealthy lived. They knew castles had thick walls, fireplaces, and protected interiors. They knew monasteries offered warmth, structure, and regular meals. But these spaces were not meant for them. The social order was rigid, and movement between classes was rare. For peasants, adapting to hardship was far more realistic than dreaming of escape from it. As populations grew and land became more crowded, pressure increased. Villages expanded into marginal areas. Forests were cleared. Hillsides were settled. Good building materials were not always available. Stone was expensive. Timber could be scarce or tightly controlled by landowners. What remained was earth abundant, accessible, and reliable. And in a world where survival mattered more than comfort, reliability mattered above all else. This is the world that shaped medieval housing choices. A world where warmth outweighed light, where protection outweighed appearance, and where endurance outweighed ease. To understand why people would later choose to live partially or entirely underground, it is necessary to first understand this mindset. Without it, such decisions seem strange, even shocking. With it, they begin to make a quiet, unsettling sense. Because in the medieval world, survival was never guaranteed, and comfort was a luxury most people could not afford to consider. Life above ground was louder, colder, and more dangerous than we imagine. When we picture medieval life, it is easy to imagine quiet villages resting peacefully beneath open skies. We often think of slow days, simple routines, and a kind of rustic calm. But the reality of life above ground was far less gentle. It was loud in ways that never fully faded, cold in ways that settled deep into the body, and dangerous in ways that were both sudden and constant. Sound carried differently in medieval settlements. Homes were built close together, often with thin walls made of wood, mud, or loosely packed stone. There was little separation between work and rest, between people and animals, between private life and public noise. Chickens wandered freely. Livestock slept close to human dwellings. Carts creaked across uneven ground. Tools struck wood and metal from sunrise to sunset. Even at night, villages were rarely silent. Animals shifted, people coughed, and fires crackled unpredictably. This constant noise was not just an annoyance. It was exhausting. There were no closed rooms to retreat into, no insulation to soften sound. Sleep came lightly and was easily broken. For people whose bodies were already strained by labor, the inability to fully rest made daily life harder than we often imagine. Silence, like comfort, was a luxury few could access. Cold was an even more serious enemy. Above-ground homes were exposed to wind from every direction. Gaps in walls let air pass freely. Roofs leaked heat as quickly as they let in rain. Fireplaces, when they existed, were inefficient and unpredictable. Smoke often filled the room before warmth did. In winter, frost could form indoors, coating walls and bedding alike. People woke with numb hands and stiff joints, already tired before the day had begun. The cold was not seasonal discomfort. It was a constant threat, prolonged. Exposure weakened the body, making illness more likely and recovery slower. Respiratory problems were common, especially in children and the elderly. A long winter could quietly reduce a village's population without any single dramatic event. Death came not with violence, but with persistence. Weather did not need to be extreme to be destructive. Heavy rain turned roads into rivers of mud. Roofs collapsed under accumulated snow. Winds tore apart poorly secured structures. Homes required constant maintenance. And even then, they remained fragile. A single storm could undo months of labor. Rebuilding was not optional. It was necessary for survival, even when resources were already stretched thin. Fire posed another danger. Above-ground homes were built from flammable materials and crowded close together. Open flames were used for cooking, heating, and light. One spark could spread quickly, especially in dry conditions. Entire villages were sometimes lost to fires that began quietly and grew uncontrollably. There were no organized fire brigades, no reliable means of containment. When fire took hold, people could only flee and hope something remained when it was over. Beyond the elements, violence was a persistent concern. Medieval peasants lived under constant uncertainty. Warfare, raids, and local conflicts were part of the landscape. Armies moved slowly, but they left lasting damage. Fields were trampled, crops were seized or destroyed, homes were looted or burned. Even small-scale disputes between neighboring lords could disrupt daily life for those caught in between. Above ground, visibility was a vulnerability. Smoke rising from a village could attract unwanted attention. Travelers passing through could be friendly or dangerous. There was little protection from outsiders, and few places to hide. Walls and fortifications were expensive and rare for peasant communities. When trouble came, it arrived directly at the doorstep. Animals added another layer of risk. Livestock were essential to survival, but they also brought disease and injury. Large animals could panic and cause harm. Smaller animals carried pests that spread illness. Rodents were a constant presence, drawn by stored grain and warmth. They chewed through walls, contaminated food, and moved freely between homes. Keeping them out entirely was nearly impossible. Daily work itself was dangerous. Tools were heavy and crude. Accidents were common and often serious. A cut could become infected. A broken bone could end a person's ability to work, turning survival into a collective challenge for the entire household. Medical knowledge was limited, and help was not always available. Above ground, risk was woven into every routine. There was also no clear boundary between inside and outside. Doors were thin. Windows, if they existed at all, were often rain, dust, insects, and noise moved freely in and out of living spaces. Privacy was minimal. Exposure was constant. The home offered little refuge from the world beyond its walls. Even during moments of rest, danger lingered. Night did not bring safety. It brought uncertainty. Without artificial lighting, darkness was nearly complete. Movement outside was risky. Inside, fires had to be managed carefully to avoid disaster. Sleep was shallow, interrupted by sound, cold, or fear. The idea of a peaceful night's rest was more aspiration than reality. To modern observers, these conditions can feel overwhelming. It is tempting to view them as signs of backwardness or poor planning. But for medieval peasants, this was not a failure of imagination. It was the reality of limited resources, constant pressure, and an environment that offered little forgiveness. Life above ground demanded constant vigilance. It required strength not just of body, but of patience. Every day was an effort to manage noise, cold, and danger without being consumed by them. Over time, people began to look for ways to reduce these threats, not to eliminate them entirely, but to make them more manageable. This search for stability did not begin with grand architectural ideas or ambitious designs. It began quietly, with observation. People noticed where the wind was weakest, where the earth held warmth longer, where sound softened rather than echoed. They learned, slowly and without theory, that the ground itself could offer what the air above could not. But that realization did not happen all at once, and it did not come without cost. The medieval landscape, wind, mud, and unforgiving seasons. To understand medieval life, it is necessary to step outside the village and look closely at the land itself, not as a picturesque backdrop, but as a constant presence that shaped every decision people made. The medieval landscape was not gentle. It did not offer stability or predictability. Instead, it pressed down on those who lived within it through wind that never fully rested, mud that refused to dry, and seasons that arrived without mercy. Wind was one of the most overlooked forces of medieval life. It moved freely across open fields, through forests thinned by human settlement, and directly into villages that had little protection against it. Above-ground homes stood exposed, with walls that rattled and roofs that lifted slightly with every strong gust. In winter, the wind did more than chill the air. It stripped warmth from bodies and buildings alike, making fires less effective and rest harder to find. People learned quickly that wind did not need to be violent to be destructive. A steady, persistent breeze could drain heat from a home day after day, forcing families to burn more fuel than they could easily spare. It slipped through cracks, under doors, and between loosely packed materials. There was no true barrier against it, only attempts to slow it down. Each winter, the wind reminded people that their shelters were temporary defenses at best. Mud was an equally relentless adversary. Medieval roads were rarely paved. Most were little more than packed earth, shaped by footsteps and wagon wheels. Rain transformed these paths into thick, clinging mud that swallowed shoes and slowed travel to a crawl. Moving goods became exhausting. Visiting neighboring villages turned into an all-day effort. Isolation increased, not because of distance, but because of terrain. Within villages, mud followed people everywhere. It coated floors, clothing, tools, and food. Homes built directly on the earth had no barrier between living space and ground. During wet seasons, moisture crept upward, soaking bedding and rotting wooden supports. Walls weakened. Insects thrived. Dampness settled into lungs and joints, contributing to chronic illness that rarely had clear explanations. Fields, too, were at the mercy of mud. Heavy rains could delay planting or destroy young crops before they had a chance to grow. Farmers walked their land daily, judging the soil by feel, hoping it would dry enough to work. But the seasons did not respond to hope. When the ground remained saturated, there was little to do, but waiting often carried consequences. Seasonal change was not gradual. It arrived suddenly and decisively. Summers could be short and unpredictable. A warm spring did not guarantee a mild year. Frost could return unexpectedly, killing crops and reshaping plans overnight. Autumn storms could arrive early, bringing cold rain that soaked harvests before they could be stored safely. Each season carried its own risks, and none could be taken for granted. Winter was the most feared. It closed roads, limited food supplies, and tested the strength of every structure. Snow accumulated on weak roofs, causing collapses that could injure or kill those inside. Ice made movement dangerous, turning simple tasks into hazards. Fuel supplies dwindled as weeks stretched into months. Families rationed wood and peat carefully, knowing that running out could be fatal. The landscape offered little warning. There were no reliable forecasts, no long-term planning tools beyond memory and tradition. People relied on signs that were often ambiguous: cloud formations, animal behavior, the feel of the air. When these signs failed, the cost could be severe. A single misjudgment could mean hunger or exposure. Flooding was another quiet threat. Rivers that provided water and fertile soil could also destroy everything nearby. Heavy rains upstream caused sudden rises in water levels, inundating fields and homes with little time to react. Possessions were few, but even those could be lost. Rebuilding after floods took time, effort, and resources that were already limited. The medieval landscape also shaped social life. Communities clustered together not out of preference, but necessity. Isolation was dangerous. Help was needed to repair damage, share labor, and survive emergencies. Yet even within these communities, the land imposed strain. When resources were scarce, cooperation became fragile. Tension grew. Survival often came before harmony. Above ground, there was no escape from these forces. The land surrounded every structure, pressed against every wall, and influenced every moment. Homes were built to respond, not to resist. People adjusted their behavior, their routines, and their expectations to match what the landscape allowed. When adaptation failed, suffering followed. Over time, patterns emerged. People noticed which areas stayed warmer, which stayed drier, and which offered some protection from wind. Valleys provided shelter, but risked flooding. Hills offered drainage, but caught stronger winds. Forest edges broke gusts, but came with their own dangers. Every choice involved trade-offs, and none offered complete safety. In this environment, the ground itself began to seem less like an obstacle and more like a resource. Earth held warmth longer than air. It absorbed sound rather than carrying it. It offered stability when weather shifted suddenly. These observations were not theoretical. They were learned through experience, through trial, error, and loss. No one set out with the intention of reshaping how people lived. There was no single moment of invention or revelation. Instead, small adjustments accumulated, A wall built deeper into the soil. A floor lowered slightly to reduce drafts. A storage space carved into a hillside. Each change was practical, modest, and rooted in immediate need. The medieval landscape did not inspire comfort. It demanded response. And slowly, almost without notice, those responses began to pull people closer to the earth itself. But the earth, like everything else, came with its own costs. And those costs would shape daily life in ways that were not always visible from the surface. Why shelter meant safety, not status. In the medieval world, shelter was not a symbol. It was not a statement of identity, ambition, or success. For the vast majority of people, a home existed for one reason only: to keep danger out. The idea that a house could represent social standing or personal taste belonged to a small and distant elite. For peasants, shelter was measured not by how it looked, but by how well it protected those inside. Modern societies often associate housing with status. Size, location, materials, and design all communicate wealth and position. But in medieval villages, these distinctions were far less pronounced among ordinary people. Most homes looked similar because most people faced the same risks. Cold, hunger, illness, and violence did not discriminate based on pride or appearance. A shelter that failed to provide safety was not impressive. It was dangerous. Safety, in this context, meant endurance. A good shelter was one that remained standing after storms, that stayed warm enough through winter nights, and that did not require constant rebuilding. It was one that reduced exposure, even if only slightly. In a world where small disadvantages accumulated quickly, reducing risk by even a narrow margin could make the difference between survival and loss. This way of thinking shaped every building decision. Peasants did not ask whether a home looked welcoming. They asked whether it could withstand wind. They did not prioritize windows or open space. They prioritized walls that blocked drafts and roofs that did not collapse under snow. A darker home that stayed warm was preferable to a brighter one that leaked heat. Visibility was less important than durability. There was also little incentive to display wealth. In many regions, standing out could attract unwanted attention. Excessive comfort or visible prosperity might invite higher taxes, demands from landlords, or suspicion from neighbors. In uncertain times, blending in offered a kind of protection. Modest housing was not just a reflection of poverty, it was a strategy. Land ownership further reinforced this mindset. Most peasants did not own the land they lived on. They worked it in exchange for protection or the right to farm. Investing heavily in above-ground structures on land that could be reclaimed or reassigned made little sense. A shelter needed to be functional and adaptable, not permanent or impressive. The less visible and less costly it was, the safer the investment. Social expectations played a role as well. Medieval communities valued conformity over individuality. Homes that looked similar reinforced shared identity and mutual dependence. Excessive variation could signal arrogance or separation from communal norms. Safety came not only from walls, but from belonging. To live as others lived was, in itself, a form of security. Shelter was also deeply tied to labor. A home was not a place to escape work. It was an extension of it. Tools were stored inside. Food was processed nearby. Animals often shared the same space. The boundary between domestic life and survival labor was thin. A shelter that supported these activities was valued more than one that offered comfort in isolation. Fireplaces, when present, were not decorative centers. They were survival tools. Smoke-filled rooms were accepted because fire was essential. People tolerated irritation, coughing, and darkened walls because warmth mattered more than air quality. The idea of a clean, separate living space was secondary to the need for heat and cooking. Children grew up understanding this logic instinctively. From an early age, they learned that a home's purpose was protection, not pleasure. They watched adults reinforce weak walls, patch roofs, and block drafts with whatever materials were available. These acts were not improvements. They were defenses. Maintenance was constant because danger was constant. In times of crisis, this mindset became even clearer. During war or famine, people abandoned anything that did not directly contribute to survival. Homes were stripped down to their essential. Decorative elements disappeared first. Space was condensed. Families crowded together to conserve warmth and share resources. Shelter became less about living well and more about staying alive. Even among the wealthier classes, safety often outweighed comfort. Castles and fortified homes emphasized thick walls, narrow openings, and defensible positions. While these structures displayed power, their primary function was protection. Comfort existed within limits imposed by fear. The same principle applied at every level of society, though expressed differently. For peasants, however, the margin for error was much smaller. They could not afford structures that failed. They could not rebuild easily. After disaster, their shelters had to work consistently and quietly. A house that attracted attention, demanded upkeep, or exposed its inhabitants to risk was not worth the cost. Over time, this created a culture of restraint. Housing choices became conservative, repetitive, and grounded in experience rather than innovation. People copied what had worked before. They trusted familiar forms. If a particular design had kept a family alive through previous winters, it was worth repeating, even if it was uncomfortable or unpleasant. This is why medieval shelters often appear crude to modern observers. They were not designed to impress or inspire. They were designed to endure. A successful shelter was one that went unnoticed by the weather, by outsiders, and by history itself. As pressures increased, population growth, resource scarcity, environmental strain, focus on safety intensified. People began to prioritize protection in new ways, experimenting quietly with form and placement. Shelter became less about standing apart from the land and more about working with it. The idea that a home could disappear into its rather than rise above them began to feel less strange. Safety was not found in visibility or height, but in solidity and concealment. And in that logic, the ground itself offered possibilities that walls alone could not. But choosing safety over status came with sacrifices. And those sacrifices would soon reshape not only how people live but where earth as the first and most reliable building material. Long before architecture became an expression of beauty or power, building was an act of necessity. In the medieval world, people did not begin construction by asking what a structure should look like. They asked what materials were available, what could be gathered without cost, and what would last long enough to justify the effort. More often than not, the answer to all three questions was the same. Earth. Earth was everywhere. It did not need to be transported over long distances. It did not belong to anyone in the way timber or stone often did. It could be dug, shaped, packed, and reused with simple tools. For medieval peasants living close to survival, These qualities mattered more than any aesthetic consideration. Earth was not ideal, but it was dependable. Stone, while durable, was expensive and difficult to work. Quarrying required permission, labor, and skill. Transporting stone was slow and physically demanding. Timber, though easier to shape, was often controlled by landowners or limited by deforestation. In many regions, forests had already been thinned by centuries of use. Cutting wood without permission could bring punishment. Earth, by contrast, lay beneath everyone's feet. This availability shaped building traditions quietly and consistently. Walls were packed from soil mixed with straw. Floors were compacted dirt, sometimes covered with reeds or rushes. Foundations were shallow, often little more than trenches filled with packed earth and stones gathered from nearby fields. These methods were not primitive guesses. They were the result of long familiarity. People knew how earth behaved in heat, cold, and moisture because they lived with it daily. Earth had one advantage that other materials struggled to match: thermal stability. While wood and stone responded quickly to changes in temperature, earth changed slowly. It absorbed warmth during the day and released it gradually at night. In winter, it held heat longer than exposed materials. This quality was not understood in scientific terms, but it was felt. Homes built closer to the ground, or partially within it, remained more stable in temperature than those fully exposed to the air. This stability mattered deeply. Fuel was limited. Fires could not burn continuously without exhausting supplies. Any structure that reduced the need for constant heating offered a significant advantage. Earth did not eliminate the cold, but it softened over long winters. This difference accumulated quietly, reducing illness, conserving energy, and increasing the chances of survival. Sound behaved differently as well. Earth absorbed noise rather than reflecting it. Winds that howled above ground became muted below the surface. The constant clatter of village life softened. This reduction in noise was not a luxury, but it contributed to rest. In a world where exhaustion was common, even slight improvements in sleep mattered. Earth was also forgiving. When walls cracked, they could be repaired with more soil. When floors became uneven, they could be repacked. Damage did not always require replacement. It required adjustment. This adaptability suited a world where time and resources were limited. Repairs could be made gradually, often by the inhabitants themselves, without specialized skills. There were cultural traditions tied to earth as well. Building techniques were passed down through observation and imitation rather than formal instruction. Children watched adults mix soil, reinforce walls, and adjust structures seasonally. Knowledge accumulated slowly and locally. What worked in one region might not work in another, but the underlying principle remained consistent. Use what the land provides. Earth-based construction also aligned with medieval ideas about homes were not expected to last for generations in the way stone monuments were. They were expected to serve their purpose for a time and then be adapted, rebuilt, or abandoned as circumstances changed. Earth structures could be reshaped without regret. There was no illusion of permanence, only continuity. As pressures increased, people began to experiment subtly with how earth was used. Walls were thickened, floors were lowered, storage spaces were carved into slopes or hillsides. These changes were rarely dramatic. They did not represent a shift in philosophy so much as a refinement of existing practice. Earth was already familiar. People simply used more of it. Hillsides offered particular opportunities. Digging into a slope provided immediate insulation on multiple sides. One wall could be replaced entirely by earth. Wind exposure decreased. Roofs could be partially supported by the land itself. These structures blended into the landscape, not by design, but by practicality. The land offered support, and people accepted it. Earth also offered concealment. Structures built into the ground were less visible from a distance. Smoke dispersed more subtly. In times of unrest, this mattered. While these homes were not hidden intentionally, their low profile reduced attention. Visibility had become a liability, and earth reduced it naturally. There were limits, of course. Earth was heavy. Poor drainage could lead to dampness. Roof collapses were a real risk if construction was careless or maintenance neglected. Insects and rodents thrived in soil. Living close to the ground brought new problems, even as it solved others. But medieval peasants did not seek perfection. They sought balance. What mattered was reliability. Earth did not promise comfort, but it offered predictability. It responded consistently to weather. It did not burn easily. It did not require constant replacement. Over time, this reliability outweighed its drawbacks. People learned how to manage moisture, reinforce weak points, and adapt designs to local conditions. This gradual shift did not produce uniform results. Some regions embraced earth-based structures more fully than others. Climate, soil type, and tradition all played a role. But across much of medieval Europe, earth became central to how ordinary people built and lived. It was not celebrated, but it was trusted. From the outside, these structures appeared humble, even crude. They lacked the clean lines and permanence of stone. But from within, they offered something precious: stability. In a world defined by uncertainty, earth provided a measure of consistency that few other materials could. The choice to rely on earth was not a rejection of progress. It was a response to reality. People worked with what they had, shaped by what they needed most. Over time, this reliance deepened, drawing homes closer to the land itself. And as walls thickened and floors sank lower, the line between building on the earth and building within it began to blur. But living with the earth was not the same as mastering it, and the next step would require more than material. It would require intention. Homes dug slowly, not designed beautifully. Medieval underground homes did not begin as finished ideas. They were not planned on parchment or measured with precision. There were no blueprints, no clear sense of what the final space would look like. Instead, these homes emerged slowly, shaped by hands, time, and necessity rather than design. Digging was hard work. Earth did not move easily, especially with the tools available to medieval peasants. Spades were simple. Picks were heavy. Progress came inch by inch, often spread across weeks or even months. Digging usually happened alongside regular labor after, tending fields, caring for animals, or repairing tools. There was no dedicated building season for such homes. Work continued when it could. Because of this, underground homes were rarely created all at once. A shallow pit might be dug first, offering some shelter from the wind. Later, it might be deepened. A wall might be reinforced after a winter exposed weaknesses. A small alcove might be carved out for storage once the need became clear. Each change responded to experience, not to a preconceived vision. Beauty played little role in these decisions. Straight lines were rare. Symmetry was accidental. Corners followed the resistance of soil rather than human preference. Walls curved because digging them straight required more effort. Ceilings sloped where the ground demanded it. What mattered was that the space held together and served its purpose. This gradual process meant that no two homes were exactly alike. Even within the same village, underground dwellings varied in shape and depth. Differences reflected soil conditions, family, size, labor availability, and simple trial and error. Some homes were shallow, barely dipping below the surface. Others extended deeper, tucked into hillsides or beneath existing structures. Mistakes were common. A wall might collapse after heavy rain. A ceiling might sag under its own weight. When this happened, rebuilding was slow and exhausting. But these failures also taught lessons. People learned where soil was stable and where it was not. They learned how much earth could safely be removed and where support was needed. Wood was sometimes used to reinforce weak areas, but it was rarely abundant. Timber had to be used carefully, saved for critical points rather than decorative features. Posts supported ceilings. Simple frames held entrances open. There was no excess. Every piece of wood used underground was one less piece available elsewhere. Lighting was another challenge. Underground spaces did not invite light. Openings were small, often angled to reduce drafts and rain. During the day, faint light filtered in, just enough to see shapes and movement. At night, fire provided illumination, though it came with smoke and risk. These homes were dim by modern standards, but darkness was accepted as normal. The process of digging also shaped how people thought about space. Rooms were not divided by walls so much as by use. One area was closer to the fire. Another was reserved for sleeping. Storage tucked into recesses in the earth. Movement through the space followed habit rather than design. The home adapted to its occupants, not the other way around. There was no expectation of completion. An underground home was never truly finished. It evolved over time, responding to changing needs. As families grew, spaces were expanded. As children left, areas fell into disuse. Repairs blended into modifications, making it difficult to separate maintenance from construction. This slow evolution reflected a broader medieval attitude toward building. Structures were not fixed objects. They were living spaces, altered gradually as conditions changed. Permanence was not assumed. Adaptability was valued far more. From the outside, these homes often appeared unimpressive. Some were barely visible at all. Entrances might be marked by nothing more than a low opening or a slight depression in the ground. There were no facades, no decorative elements to announce their presence. They existed quietly, almost apologetically, within the landscape. This lack of visual presence was not a failure. It was a reflection of priorities. Above ground, visibility had brought risk-wind, cold, attention. Below ground, subtlety offered protection. A home that did not stand out was less exposed to weather and less likely to attract unwanted notice. Living in such a space required adjustment. Moving through low passages strained backs and knees. Standing fully upright was not always possible. Tasks were performed, crouched or seated. Over time, bodies adapted. Movements became economical. The space shaped behavior, just as behavior had shaped the space. Children learned these movements early. They grew up navigating confined interiors, learning where to step and where to duck. For them, this environment was not strange. It was simply home. Their sense of normal was formed underground, not by comparison to something brighter or larger. There was also a psychological effect to this kind of living. Underground spaces enclosed sound and light, creating a sense of separation from the outside world. Weather felt distant, even when it raged above. This separation offered comfort, but it also narrowed experience. The world became smaller, focused inward on the immediate space and the people within it. Yet this inward focus served a purpose. It reduced distraction. It concentrated attention on essential tasks: maintaining fire, preserving food, caring for family. Life slowed down underground, not by choice, but by constraint. And in that slower pace, endurance became easier. These homes were not admired by contemporaries. They were not described in songs or celebrated in stories. They existed beneath notice, both literally and socially. Chroniclers wrote about castles, churches, and cities. The underground lives of peasants rarely appeared in records, not because they were secret, but because they were considered ordinary. Ordinary did not mean easy. Digging into the earth demanded strength and persistence. It required accepting discomfort and risk. It meant trusting that the effort would be worth it over time. That trust was built slowly, reinforced by winters survived and storms endured. As more families adopted similar practices, underground living became less experimental and more familiar. Knowledge spread informally. People observed what worked for their neighbors and adapted it for themselves. There was no movement or philosophy behind it, just shared experience. What emerged from this process was not a new architectural style, but a pattern of living shaped by necessity. Homes were not designed to impress or inspire. They were dug to solve problems, one at a time. Each shovel of earth removed was a small decision, made in favor of stability over comfort. And while these homes lacked beauty in the traditional sense, they offered something more valuable to those who lived within them, a measure of control in a world that offered very little. But control had its limits, and as people settled deeper into the ground, they would begin to encounter new challenges that darkness itself would bring. Darkness as a normal part of daily life. Darkness was not something medieval peasants waited for at the end of the day. It was already there when they woke, deep inside homes carved into earth and soil. The morning did not arrive with light, but with movement. The slow shifting of bodies on straw bedding, the sound of breath returning to consciousness, the careful search for embers left alive through the night. For these families, darkness was not a condition, it was the default state of existence. The underground home was shaped by shadow. Walls were uneven, ceilings low, and corners faded into blackness long before the eye could reach them. Even at midday when the sun stood high above the fields, its presence underground was only symbolic. A thin line of pale light might slip through a narrow entrance or a crude ventilation hole, but it never fully entered the room. It touched the space briefly, then disappeared, leaving behind a memory rather than illumination. Fire was the only true source of light, and even fire was unreliable. Smoke often filled the room faster than brightness could spread. Flames flickered low to conserve fuel, casting unstable shapes against dirt walls. These shadows moved constantly, stretching and collapsing as if alive. Over time, people stopped paying attention to them. Darkness became so familiar that it faded from conscious thought, much like air or breath. One did not notice it unless something disrupted it. Daily life adapted accordingly. Tasks were arranged, around what could be, done by feel rather than sight. Cooking pots were positioned by memory. Tools were returned to the same places after every use, not out of habit alone, but out of necessity. Losing an object in darkness meant time wasted, frustration, and sometimes danger. Sharp tools, open flames, and fragile containers demanded careful movements. Precision replaced speed. Patience became a survival skill. Time itself behaved differently underground. Without clear light, hours lost their edges. There was no sharp beginning to the day, no clean division between work and rest. The concept of morning existed more as a routine than a visual change. When the fire was stirred and food prepared, the day had begun. When exhaustion settled into muscles and conversation grew sparse, the day ended. Darkness did not announce nightfall, it simply deepened. Children learned this rhythm early. They were born into shadow, raised without bright rooms or open spaces. Their understanding of the world was shaped by sound, texture, and proximity. A parent's presence was known by warmth and voice rather than by sight. Faces were recognized at close range, in firelight, through repeated familiarity. This created a different kind of intimacy, less visual, more sensory. Games, when they existed, were quiet and close. Loud movement was discouraged in confined spaces. Running was impossible. Instead, children listened to stories, memorized sounds, and learned to sit still for long periods. Imagination filled the spaces that light could not reach. Monsters were not imagined in the dark because darkness itself was normal. Fear came instead from hunger, cold, or unfamiliar noises from above ground. Darkness also soft identity. In shadow, distinctions blurred. Wealth, appearance, and even age became less visible. Everyone looked similar by firelight. This did not eliminate hierarchy, but it muted it. People were defined more by their role than by their appearance. The strongest voice mattered more than the sharpest face. Reputation traveled through words, not through visual display. Silence worked together with darkness. Underground homes absorbed sound. The earth dampened noise from outside, and thick walls kept voices contained. Conversations were quiet, not out of secrecy, but out of habit. Loudness felt unnecessary, even disruptive. This created a calm that modern imagination rarely associates with medieval life. It was not peaceful because life was quiet because energy had to be conserved. Darkness encouraged endurance rather than resistance. There was no expectation that life should be bright or comfortable. Complaining about darkness made little sense when it could not be changed. Instead, people adapted emotionally. They learned to accept limitation without constant frustration. This acceptance shaped temperament, fostering patience and emotional restraint. Strong feelings existed, but they were often carried internally, shared only in trusted moments. Religion took on deeper meaning in this environment. Light became more than a metaphor, it was a promise. Religious language spoke of illumination, divine light, and eternal brightness, not as abstract concepts, but as imagined relief from a lifetime of shadow. Candles used in prayer were precious not only spiritually, but practically. A lit flame during worship carried both symbolic and physical comfort. The underground home became a place where memory was stored orally, without visual records or written material. Stories were repeated again and again. Darkness made listening essential. People learned to remember long narratives, genealogies, and moral lessons. Words replaced images. History survived not through sight, but through sound. Even aging felt different in darkness. Wrinkles, scars, and physical decline were less visible. Respect for elders came from knowledge and experience rather than appearance. Death, when it arrived, did so quietly. Bodies were prepared by touch, rituals performed by firelight. Grief was shared in low voices, absorbed by the walls, witnessed by those who lived close enough to feel it. Darkness also created boundaries between the underground and the world above. Stepping outside was a transition not just physically, but mentally. Above ground, light was overwhelming. The sky felt vast, exposed, almost threatening. Many peasants preferred the contained darkness of home to the unpredictability of open space. Underground, the world felt smaller, but safer. This way of life did not romanticize darkness, but it normalized it. Darkness was not a hardship to overcome, it was a condition to be understood. People did not dream of brighter homes because imagination was limited by possibility. Instead, they focused on endurance, routine, and continuity. Each day survived was enough, and within this constant shadow, life continued quietly adapting, reshaping itself around absence of light, preparing the ground for the next chapter of survival that unfolded just beyond these walls. How underground living protected families from weather and war. For medieval peasants, protection was not an abstract idea tied to laws or armies. It was immediate, physical, and personal. Survival depended on whether a family could endure the forces that arrived without warning, storms that erased harvests overnight, and soldiers who appeared on the horizon with no concern for the lives they disrupted. Underground living was not a lifestyle choice. It was a response to a world where danger came from both the sky and the road. Weather was the first and most constant enemy. Above ground, homes built from wood, mud, and thatch offered little resistance to the elements. Heavy rain soaked walls until they sagged and collapsed. Wind tore roofs apart and carried away warmth. Snow pressed down until structures gave in under its weight. In contrast, the earth itself was stable. Dugout homes, cut into hillsides or sunk below the surface, resisted forces that destroyed everything above them. Rain passed overhead. Wind became distant noise. Temperature shifted slowly, protecting families from sudden extremes. The soil acted as insulation long before people understood the science behind it. In winter, underground spaces held onto heat generated by bodies, animals, and fire. In summer, the same spaces remained cool while fields baked under the sun. This consistency mattered more than comfort. A stable environment meant fewer illnesses, less fuel consumed, and a better chance of surviving long seasons when resources were scarce. Underground, survival became more predictable. Protection from weather also meant protection from exposure. Hypothermia, heat exhaustion, and damp-related illness were constant threats above ground. Peasants did not have spare clothing or medical care. One severe night could be fatal. Underground homes reduced that risk. Even when food was limited, warmth increased the odds of endurance. The earth created a barrier that turned extreme conditions into manageable ones. But weather was only half the danger. War moved unpredictably through medieval landscapes, often ignoring the lives of those who worked the land. Peasant villages were rarely defended. Armies took what they needed: food, animals, labor, and moved on, leaving destruction behind. Above-ground homes were visible from a distance, signaling presence and resources. Smoke rising from chimneys invited attention. Underground homes did the opposite. They blended into the land. Visibility meant vulnerability. A village scene was a village at risk. Underground living reduced that risk by making families harder to detect. From a distance, fields appeared empty. Homes were hidden beneath slopes, forest edges, or subtle depressions in the ground. Even when soldiers passed nearby, they often overlooked what they could not easily see. In times of conflict, invisibility was a form of defense. When danger approached, underground spaces became places of refuge. Families could retreat inside, extinguish fires, and wait in silence. Sound traveled poorly through earth. Movement above ground became muffled, distorted. The underground world felt separated, protected by layers of soil that absorbed chaos. While not impenetrable, these spaces offered time to hide, time to survive, time to be overlooked. The structure of underground homes also made them difficult to destroy quickly. Unlike wooden buildings, they could not be easily burned. Fire consumed roofs and walls above ground, but underground dwellings denied flames the air they needed. Smoke could still be deadly, but destruction required effort and intention. For passing armies focused on speed and conquest, such effort was often not worth the cost. Families adapted their behavior to maximize this protection. Fires were kept low. Smoke was carefully vented or extinguished during moments of threat. Noise was minimized. Children learned early the importance of silence. These were not lessons taught gently, they were learned through fear and repetition. Survival depended on discipline shared by everyone inside the home. Underground living also protected resources. Stored grain, tools, and preserved food were less likely to be discovered or stolen. In a world where a single lost harvest could mean starvation, concealment mattered. The earth hid not only people, but the means by which they lived. This allowed families to recover more quickly after raids or storms, rebuilding life quietly rather than starting from nothing. Psychologically, underground homes offered a sense of control in an uncontrollable world. Peasants could not stop storms or wars, but they could choose how deeply they dug, how carefully they hid, how quietly they lived. This small agency mattered. It transformed survival from passive suffering into active endurance. Even when loss was inevitable, there was dignity in preparation. Children growing up in these spaces absorbed this mindset. Danger was understood as something external, something that passed over the surface of the earth while life continued below. This created a mental division between the safe interior and the hostile outside world. Home was not defined by walls or decoration, but by depth and concealment. The land itself became an ally. Hills, soil, and stone were not obstacles, but shields. Peasants learned to read the landscape not for beauty, but for protection. A slope that broke the wind, a patch of earth that drained well, a place where sound faded quickly. These details mattered more than access to light or space. Underground living represented a partnership with the land, not an attempt to dominate it. Over time, this way of life shaped communities. Villages spread out rather than clustering tightly. Homes were separated, less obvious. Paths were subtle, known mainly to those who lived there. Outsiders saw emptiness where life existed. This fragmentation reduced the impact of disaster. A single strike could not destroy everything at once. Yet protection came with cost. Isolation increased. Help from neighbors took longer to reach. Rescue during collapse or fire was difficult. Underground safety was never absolute. Was a balance of risk, but for many. It was the best option available in a world that offered few guarantees. As seasons passed and conflicts came and went, underground homes continued to serve their purpose quietly. They did not stop history from moving, but they allowed ordinary people to endure it. Beneath the surface, life persisted hidden, restrained, and shaped by the constant calculation of safety against exposure. Fire, smoke, and the struggle to breathe indoors. Fire was both the heart of the underground home and its greatest threat. In a world buried beneath layers of earth, flame was the only source of warmth, light, and cooked food. Without it, life underground would have been impossible. Yet every time a fire was lit, it brought with it a danger that could not be fully controlled. Smoke, trapped by low ceilings and narrow exits, lingered long after the flames had settled, filling lungs as quietly and relentlessly as darkness filled the room. The hearth was usually nothing more than a shallow pit in the floor, or a crude stone ring built wherever the ground was firm enough to resist collapse. There were no chimneys in most underground dwellings, no clear path for smoke to escape. Instead, thin openings were cut into walls or ceilings, small and imperfect. Some smoke drifted out, but much of it remained, spreading through the space, until it coated everything in a thin layer of soot. Walls darkened over time, not from age, but from years of burning fuel in enclosed air. Breathing became an act of endurance. The air was thick, especially in winter when fires burned longer and ventilation was kept to a minimum to preserve heat. Eyes stung, throats burned. Coughing was common, accepted as part of daily life rather than a sign of illness. Lungs adapted as best they could, but damage accumulated slowly. People did not speak of long-term harm because survival rarely allowed such reflection. If the fire burned, the family lived another day. Fire dictated the rhythm of the household. It had to be fed carefully, watched constantly. Too small, and the cold crept back in. Too large, and smoke became unbearable. Children learned early to respect flame, not through instruction alone, but through experience. A careless movement could scatter embers across straw bedding or clothing. Burns were common, treated with home remedies and endurance rather than medical care. Scars marked bodies, as reminders of how closely survival walked alongside danger. Fuel was precious. Wood, dried dung, and plant matter were gathered whenever possible, often from far away. Burning anything produced smoke, but families burned what they had. The quality of air depended not on choice, but on availability. Damp fuel produced heavier smoke, choking and persistent. Yet damp fuel was often all that existed after rain or during winter months. Underground homes trapped this smoke, allowing it to seep into clothing, hair, and skin. The smell of fire became permanent. Sleeping near a fire carried its own risks. Many families slept in shifts, rotating closer and farther from the hearth, depending on warmth and air quality. Those closest absorbed heat, but also the heaviest smoke. Over time, people developed strategically, with faces turned away, elevating heads slightly, or waking periodically to adjust embers. These were small adaptations, passed down quietly, rarely questioned. Smoke blurred vision and time. In dim, smoky air, objects lost sharpness. Movement slowed. Conversations were shorter, voices lower. Smoke demanded attention without offering relief. Yet it also provided a strange form of protection. Thick air concealed presence, making underground homes even harder to detect From outside, smoke rarely escaped invisible columns. Instead, it seeped slowly, dispersing before it could signal life below the surface. Fire-shaped, social interaction. People gathered around it not only for warmth, but because it was the only place where light existed. Faces emerged in flickering outlines. Expressions shifted with the flame. Stories were told in its presence because darkness beyond the fire felt endless. The hearth became the emotional center of the home, a place of shared warmth in a world that offered little else. However, the same fire that united also separated. Elderly family members, already weakened, struggled most with smoke. Children coughed through the night. Respiratory illness was common, though rarely understood. Shortness of breath, persistent coughing, and fatigue were accepted as normal stages of life rather than symptoms. People adapted expectations rather than environments. During storms or times of threat, fires were reduced or extinguished entirely. Cold and darkness replaced smoke, but safety demanded it. Families wrapped themselves together, conserving heat through closeness. The absence of fire revealed how dependent underground life had become on controlled flame. Without it, survival narrowed quickly. Fire also connected the underground world to the world above. Fuel had to be gathered, ash removed, embers managed. These tasks forced interaction with the surface, exposing families to weather and danger. Every fire carried a reminder that underground safety was never completed, depended on constant exchange with the outside. Despite the hardship, fire was never abandoned. It remained essential, unavoidable. People learned to live with smoke, as they lived with darkness and dampness by, accepting discomfort as the cost of survival. Fire was not romantic or sacred. It was practical, demanding respect, but offering no mercy. Over generations, bodies adapted in small ways, habits refined themselves, and underground homes bore the marks of countless fires. Soot-stained walls, blackened ceilings, and scarred hands told silent stories of endurance. Breathing remained a struggle, but it was a struggle endured daily, quietly, without expectation of improvement. And within this smoky darkness, life continued prepared, children raised. Stories whispered, each breath drawn in air shaped by flame, carrying the weight of survival into the next moment, and onward into the challenges that waded deeper within these underground lives. Animals, humans, and heat sharing the same space in the underground homes of medieval peasants. The boundary between human life and animal life was thin, sometimes non-existent. These dwellings were not designed with separation in mind. Survival demanded efficiency, and warmth was too valuable to waste. Animals were not kept at a distance. They were brought inside, sometimes into the very same room where families slept, ate, and lived. This was not born of affection alone, but of necessity shaped by cold earth and long winters. Livestock represented life itself. A cow meant milk. A goat meant sustenance. Chickens meant eggs. Losing an animal was not an inconvenience, it was a step closer to starvation. Underground homes offered protection not only for people, but for these vital creatures as well. Thick soil walls shielded them from freezing temperatures, storms, and theft. Keeping animals close ensured they survived the night just as much as it ensured the family did. Heat was the most immediate reason animals were brought indoors. In an underground space, warmth accumulated slowly and was easily lost. Fire helped, but fuel was scarce and smoke dangerous. Animal bodies provided a different kind of heat constant, living warmth that did not need tending. A cow's slow breath, a sheep's thick wool, the quiet shifting of hooves and bodies all contributed to a shared thermal balance. Together, humans and animals created an environment where survival became slightly more manageable. The arrangement of space reflected this logic. Animals were usually kept near the entrance or in shallow dugout sections connected to the main living area. There was rarely a wall between species. Perhaps a low barrier, sometimes nothing at all. Sounds and smells traveled freely. The rhythm of animal life blended into the rhythm of human life. Feeding, cleaning, and tending became part of the household routine rather than separate tasks. Children grew up surrounded by animals, not as pets, but as cohabitants. They learned early how to move carefully among hooves and horns, how to read animal behavior instinctively. Fear existed, but familiarity softened it. Animals were understood as both valuable and vulnerable. They were treated with practicality rather than sentimentality. Compassion existed, but it was bound tightly to survival. The presence of animals changed the atmosphere of underground homes. Breath condensed in cold air. Moisture increased. The floor was rarely dry. Straw bedding absorbed waste, replaced when possible, reused when necessary. Cleanliness was not absent, but it followed different standards. Disease was a risk, yet exposure above ground often posed greater danger. Families accepted the trade-off. Nighttime revealed the depth of this shared existence. As darkness settled and changed from the humans and animals rested together, the sounds of breathing filled the space. A cow shifting its weight, a goat softly bleating, chickens rustling in their roosts. These noises became comforting signals of life continuing. Silence, when it came, was unsettling. Animals also acted as an early warning system. Sudden movement, agitation, or noise often signaled danger before humans were aware of it. Approaching strangers, predators, or unusual disturbances above ground could be sensed first by animals. In underground homes where visibility was limited, this sensitivity mattered. Animals extended human awareness beyond what eyes could see. The closeness between species blurred emotional boundaries. While animals were ultimately resources, their constant presence created attachment. Losing one to illness or injury affected the household deeply, not only economically, but emotionally. Yet death was accepted as part of the shared environment. Children learned early that life and loss existed side by side, without separation or ceremony. This shared space also shaped social hierarchy within the home. The strongest animals occupied the most stable ground. Humans adapted around them. Sleeping arrangements shifted seasonally, influenced by heat and necessity. Elders and infants were placed where warmth was greatest. Comfort was relative, always negotiated. Smell became an unspoken constant. Underground air carried layers of sensmo, damp earth, animal waste, human bodies. Over time, these smells faded from notice. Sensory adaptation was essential. What might overwhelm an outsider became invisible to those who lived within it daily. Normality reshaped perception. Animals influenced daily schedules as well. Feeding times structured the day. Milking required consistency. Illness demanded attention regardless of weather or exhaustion. Underground living compressed responsibilities into close quarters, leaving little room for avoidance. Care was immediate and unavoidable. This intimacy also reinforced a worldview grounded in interdependence. Humans relied on animals for heat, food, and labor. Animals relied on humans for shelter and protection. Survival was collective. The idea of independence, so often celebrated in later societies, held little meaning here. Life underground was a shared burden. The presence of animals reduced fear of solitude. Even in darkness, the home was alive. Movement, breath, warmth all signaled continuity. This mattered psychologically. In a world where isolation often meant death, constant companionship, human or animal, provided reassurance. Yet this arrangement came at a cost. Illness spread more easily. Injuries happened. Parasites thrived. Underground homes magnified every risk. But the alternatives were worse. Exposure, theft, and cold claimed lives more quickly than disease. Peasants did not choose the safest option. They chose the one that allowed endurance. Over generations, these shared spaces became tradition rather than emergency measure. Children grew into adults who saw no strangeness in sleeping beside livestock. Cultural memory preserved these practices not through instruction, but through repetition. This was simply how life was done. As conditions slowly changed in later centuries, separation between humans and animals increased. But during the medieval period, underground homes represented a time when survival erased boundaries. Heat, breath, and life itself were pulled together beneath the soil. And within these crowded, living spaces where animals shifted beside sleeping families, where warmth was shared without distinction, another layer of endurance took shape, preparing the ground for struggles that went beyond heat and shelter, and into challenges that lingered within the body and the walls themselves. Disease, damp walls, and the cost of survival. Disease was not an unexpected visitor in the underground lives of medieval peasants. It was a quiet presence, woven into the walls, the air, and the ground itself. Unlike war or storms, illness did not arrive suddenly. It grew slowly, patiently, feeding on dampness, darkness, and exhaustion. For those who lived beneath the soil, sickness was not an exception to life. It was part of its rhythm. The walls of underground homes were rarely dry. Earth breathed moisture constantly. Rain soaked into the ground above and traveled downward, seeping through packed soil and crude stone supports. Even in dry seasons, dampness lingered. Walls felt cool to the touch. Floors were often wet, especially near entrances or animal spaces. Straw bedding absorbed moisture and released it back into the air day after day. There was no true separation between inside and outside. The ground was both shelter and source of decay. This constant damp created an environment where the body was always under strain. Feet rarely stayed dry. Clothing never fully warmed. Skin cracked, soft, then cracked again. Small wounds took longer to heal. Infections that might have been minor above ground often lingered here, turning dangerous through neglect rather than severity. Medical knowledge was limited, but experience taught people that dampness weakened the body. Still, there was nowhere else to go. Coughs were common and persistent. Smoke damaged lungs, and damp air worsened the damage. Breathing became shallow. Over time, not always from age, but from years spent inhaling heavy air. Children coughed before they learned to speak clearly. Elders wheezed in their sleep. These sounds blended into the night, accepted as normal signs of living underground. Fever, when it came, was feared but poorly understood. Heat from illness felt different from warmth given by fire or animals. It weakened instead of comforting. Families recognized the danger of fever, but had few tools to fight it. Cool cloths, herbal infusions, prayers were the limits of response. Often, the sick remained where they lay, surrounded by the same damp walls that had weakened them in the first place. Parasites thrived in underground conditions. Fleas, lice, and worms passed easily between humans and animals, sharing the same space. Itching, sores, and infection were constant irritations. Scratching opened the skin. Open skin invited disease. This cycle repeated endlessly. Cleanliness was attempted, but water was heavy to carry and hard to heat. Washing was done when possible, not when ideal. Food storage, though safer underground, introduced its own risks. Mold grew easily in damp air. Grain spoiled silently. People learned to scrape away rot and eat what remained. Hunger forced compromises. Eating questionable food was often less dangerous than not eating at all. Stomach illnesses followed, weakening bodies already strained by cold and labor. Children suffered the most. Their bodies were still growing, their resistance limited. Many did not survive early years, and those who did carried signs of illness into adulthood: stunted growth, weakened lungs, chronic pain. Childhood was not imagined as a protected stage of life. It was a test of endurance, one that many failed quietly, without record. Yet disease was not always dramatic. Much of it was slow. Joints stiffened early, teeth decayed without relief, eyes weakened in darkness and smoke. Pain became background noise. People worked through it, slept with it, aged into it. Survival did not mean health. It meant persistence, despite decline. The damp walls themselves seemed to participate in this process. They crumbled slowly, shedding fine particles into the air. Mold crept along surfaces unseen. Earth shifted, occasionally collapsing small sections that had to be rebuilt by hand. Each repair exposed families to more moisture, more instability. But abandoning the home was rarely an option. The underground space, unhealthy as it was, remained safer than the surface. Communal living intensified the spread of illness. There was no isolation for the sick. Space did not allow it. When one person fell ill, everyone was exposed. Care was given out of necessity, not choice. Family members tended to the sick because there was no alternative. Touch, proximity, and shared air spread disease even as they provided comfort. Religion again played a role in understanding illness. Disease was often interpreted as a trial, a punishment, or a test of faith. These explanations did not cure, but they gave meaning. Meaning mattered. Without it, suffering became unbearable. Faith allowed people to endure pain they could not escape. Despite constant illness, life did not stop. Fields still needed tending. Animals still needed care. Work continued because stopping meant death of a different kind. Rest was a luxury. Those who survived learned to measure strength carefully, conserving energy, pacing labor. Weakness was not hidden, but accepted as inevitable. The cost of survival was cumulative. Each winter left marks. Each illness reduced resilience. People aged faster underground. Old age arrived early, though few reached it. The idea of a long, healthy life was foreign. Life was measured instead by seasons endured and children raised long enough to replace those who would not survive. Yet within this harsh reality, there was adaptation. People learned which parts of the home stayed driest. They raised bedding slightly. They chose where to sit, where to sleep, where to store food. Knowledge passed quietly, generation to generation, not through writing but through observation. These small adjustments did not eliminate disease, but they reduced its reach. Illness also shaped emotional life. Death was familiar, not shocking. Grief existed, but it was contained, shared briefly before work resumed. Excessive mourning was dangerous. It distracted from survival. Communities developed a restrained relationship with loss, not because they felt less, but because they had to continue. The underground home thus became a place where life and decay coexisted constantly. Damp walls held warmth and sickness in equal measure. Disease was not a failure of these homes, but part of the price paid for protection. Peasants understood this intuitively. They did not expect safety without sacrifice. And so, beneath the soil, families lived with illness as a companion rather than an enemy, managing it, enduring it, carrying its weight forward while deeper questions about privacy, space, and human dignity quietly waited to surface in the lives shaped by these confined, demanding walls. Why privacy was a concept that barely existed. For the medieval peasants who lived underground, privacy was not merely rare, it was almost non-existent. The concept, as we understand it today, would have seemed strange, even absurd. Homes were cramped, spaces were shared, and every action, from cooking to sleeping, happened within a few feet of another human being. Walls were often absent, doors were few, and ceilings were low. Life was lived, shoulder to shoulder, body to body, breath to breath, in conditions where individual seclusion was a luxury the earth itself did not permit. From the moment a child was born, they were enveloped in the constant presence of others. Infants never experienced the quiet isolation modern nurseries provide. Instead, their earliest sounds, smells, and sensations were shaped by the rhythm of the family. The rustle of straw bedding, the smell of fire smoke, the murmured voices of parents, siblings, and sometimes animals sharing the same space. Even feeding and changing occurred under the watchful proximity of older siblings or extended family members. There was no expectation that moments could be private. Every movement was absorbed into the household's collective awareness. The sleeping arrangements emphasized this lack of privacy. Beds were often simple raised platforms or bundles of straw laid side by side, so close that turning over in the night required awareness of another person's limbs. Families slept in shifts when necessary, adjusting for warmth or air quality, but rarely with any thought of personal space. Elders, adults, and children shared the same low-ceilinged rooms with animals that provided warmth, resulting in a constant physical closeness. The line between public and private life was erased by necessity, not by intention. Even daily routines reinforced this shared existence. Eating, cooking, tending to fires, mending clothing, and child rearing all occurred within the same area. Noise, smells, and movement were omnipresent. Conversations were carried out in the same small space where work was done. Laughing, arguing, or crying could not be contained. Every sound became part of the ambient life of the household. Over time, this collective immersion created a kind of emotional resilience. Children learned quickly that their actions were witnessed, and adults adapted to living without expectation of solitude. This absence of privacy extended to bodily functions. Modern bathrooms or private spaces for washing and relieving oneself did not exist in underground homes. Stray corners of the dwelling or carefully chosen areas outside were used, but even these spaces offered minimal seclusion. Bathing, when it occurred, was a shared affair in many cases, especially for children or those too weak to move far from the home. Personal boundaries were constantly negotiated rather than enforced, and modesty became a flexible concept rather than an absolute. The lack of privacy shaped social dynamics. Authority within the household, whether held by parents, elders, or the strongest adult, was reinforced by proximity. Discipline, guidance, and punishment were immediate. Children observed adult behavior constantly and absorbed norms without isolation. Mistakes or accidents could not be hidden. Learning was public, as was suffering. Over time, this created communities in miniature, where cooperation and negotiation were essential skills, and personal independence was secondary to group survival. Privacy was also a casualty of heat and shelter needs. With limited light and persistent cold, everyone huddled together near fires or animals to survive. Separating oneself physically from others was not an option, because warmth depended on proximity. Even attempts to carve a small niche for solitude were often abandoned. Space was simply too scarce. Every foot of room was shared, every inch of the dwelling functional rather than personal. This constant closeness had profound psychological effects. Individuals developed an acute awareness of others' moods, movements, and habits. People became attuned to tiny cues, the way a sibling shifted during sleep, the pause in a parent's voice, the subtle tension in another's posture. While privacy was absent, social sensitivity flourished. Survival depended as much on reading others as on tending oneself. Empathy and caution became intertwined. Children grew up accustomed to this total visibility. They were observed while playing, learning, and even resting. Secrets were rare, fleeting, and almost impossible to maintain. Lessons about social hierarchy, labor, and behavior were absorbed not through private teaching, but through constant observation. The underground home was a school of endurance and social intelligence, where every moment provided instruction. Illness further diminished privacy. When someone fell sick, care was communal and unavoidable. Every cough, fever, or movement was noticed. Adults tended to the sick constantly, administering food, medicine, or comfort within the same space where daily life continued. There was no retreat. Suffering was public. Even in deaths, privacy remained elusive. The dying were surrounded by family, animals, and the constant backdrop of life moving on around them. Privacy, as a cultural concept, also mattered less because the survival stakes were so high. Individual desires were secondary to collective safety. Sharing food, warmth, and work was a necessity rather than a choice. Every action had communal consequences. Theft, waste, or carelessness could endanger the entire household. The underground home was a microcosm where personal boundaries were subordinated to survival imperatives. Even intimate relationships were influenced. Marriage, reproduction, and affection all occurred within sight or earshot of others. Privacy during these acts was minimal, yet the community framework reinforced care and shared responsibility. Children were conceived, born, and raised in full awareness of the extended household. Norms of modesty, consent, and discretion were practiced differently, often more flexibly, shaped by necessity and survival rather than social expectation as we imagine it today. Sound and smell dictated the rhythm of Privisora rather its absence. Smoke from the hearth, the odor of animals, the damp earth itself created a sensory environment that overrode attempts at seclusion. Individuals became adept at filtering stimuli, learning to retreat inward mentally even when physically exposed. Privacy, in a mental sense, existed in fragments. Brief moments of reflection, internal planning, or quiet imagination, but never as a spatial reality. Work and rest were similarly merged. Tasks were done collectively or in view of others. Sewing, mending, weaving, and preparing meals all occurred within shared proximity. Rest was interrupted by the demands of survival or the movements of others. Every activity demanded awareness of the communal presence, and skill lay in navigating life without infringing or being infringed upon. Even as children grew into adults, the underground home continued to impose visibility. Secrets remained fleeting. Relationships were built on negotiation rather than seclusion. Conflicts were resolved openly. Discipline was administered without doors or barriers. Privacy, in this world, was a concept understood intellectually, but almost never experienced physically. Despite its absence, the lack of privacy did not always feel oppressive. Over generations, families adapted psychologically, developing coping strategies and emotional resilience. The constant presence of others became a form of security. No one was truly alone. Life was shared, observed, and mediated collectively. Trust and cooperation became inherent survival skills, and the boundaries of self were defined less by walls than by understanding and awareness. In this way, the underground home created an environment where individual existence was inseparable from collective life. The walls did not protect personal space. The soil did not provide seclusion. Instead, humans learned to navigate relationships, monitor dangers, and endure hardship together. Privacy, as a modern idea, barely existed. Yet life continued persistent, adaptive, and quietly resilient within the unyielding closeness imposed by necessity. And beneath the low ceilings, amidst the darkness, dampness, and constant observation, families lived and grew, learning that survival was communal. Boundaries were flexible, and the very concept of alone was almost meaningless in the spaces they called home. Children growing up without ever seeing a quiet home. For the children of medieval peasants, the concept of a quiet home was as foreign as sunlight to the deepest underground chambers. Silence, in the sense we understand it today, as steady, undisturbed stillness, simply did not exist in these spaces. From the moment they were born, children were immersed in a world alive with noise, movement, and constant activity. Every breath, every shuffle of straw, every rustle of an animal, and every whisper of a parent's voice contributed to a ceaseless symphony of survival. The underground home, carved from soil and stone, was never still. It was a living, breathing environment where rest and sound were inseparable, where quiet was not absent because of neglect, but because life itself demanded motion, vigilance, and care. Infants learned the rhythm of the household before they could even speak. The first sensations they experienced were the low murmur of parents and siblings, the soft grinding of straw bedding under shifting bodies, the faint vibrations of animals stirring in the corner. Darkness amplified these sounds, turning minor movements into significant signals. Even the tiniest squeak of a goat or the shuffle of a chicken triggered attention. The world above ground, though often harsher, was conceptually distant. These children knew only the subterranean life, where noise and life were entwined. The daily rhythm of a child's life was dictated by the demands of survival, not by the comfort of rest. Feeding times coincided with household routines, preparing porridge or watered grain, tending animals, and stoking embers for warmth. Tasks that adults carried out in low-light moving tools, adjusting bedding, repairing walls, created a constant undercurrent of sound. Children learned to move and speak in ways that accommodated this environment, understanding early that movement without awareness could injure them or disturb others. Silence, where it occasionally occurred, was accidental, not deliberate. Even during sleep, children experienced little peace. Beds were often shared by multiple family members, packed closely for warmth. The breathing of adults, the shifting of limbs, and the occasional snorts of animals kept the atmosphere in constant motion. Children's own rest was punctuated by the natural rhythm of the household. The cough of a parent in the night, the rustle of straw as someone rolled closer to the fire, the distant sounds of wind or rain penetrating the shallow ventilation holes. Stillness existed only in brief intervals between breaths or tasks, and even then it was partial play. A fundamental part of childhood also existed within these crowded, noisy spaces. Games were necessarily quiet, close contact, and imaginative. Children could not run freely. The low ceilings and shared space made physical exertion risky. Instead, they played with their surrounding straw, wood scraps, small stones, or animals, learning dexterity, patience, and awareness. Laughter and cries were common, but always measured against the boundaries of survival. Noise had consequences. Too loud, and a parent might scold, or worse, draw unwanted attention from predators or thieves above ground. Education, too, was shaped by the absence of quiet. There were no private lessons or isolated moments for learning. Older siblings taught younger ones how to perform daily chores, how to care for animals, and how to navigate the underground world. These lessons occurred amidst the ambient noise of survival scraping tools, crackling fire, shifting straw, and animal sounds. Knowledge was absorbed through observation, repetition, and necessity rather than through calm, focused study. The children became adept at listening closely, distinguishing between relevant sounds and background noise, a skill crucial for survival. Mealtime, often shared with the entire household and animals alike, reflected the constant disruption of quiet. Pots clanged, fire crackled, and scraps of conversation overlapped with the movements of livestock. Eating was communal, not private, and children learned quickly to adapt, to reach for food without startling others, to chew quietly enough to avoid smothering themselves in the smoky air, and to observe the rhythm of adult movements to avoid collisions. Meals were brief, functional, and punctuated by the demands of labor and care, not by leisure or reflection. Even illness intruded upon this perpetual soundscape. When a child fell sick, the household adjusted around them, but silence was never truly restored. Parents hovered, tending to the sick, while others carried on with daily work. Lying in a corner, the child was never isolated from the household's activity. Pain, fever, and discomfort were experienced alongside the constant backdrop of life: the shuffle of straw, the crackle of embers, the shifting of bodies, and the occasional low bleat of a goat. In these conditions, quiet was a fleeting shadow, not a permanent state. The psychological impact of growing up without a quiet home was profound. Children developed heightened sensitivity to sound and movement. They became alert, reactive, and acutely aware of their environment. Every creak, cough, or rustle was a signal to interpret. Fear, caution, and vigilance were cultivated from an early age, alongside resilience and adaptability. In a sense, silence became a conceptual, imagined refuge rather than a tangible experience. Children learned to construct mental spaces of quiet, imagining calm even when surrounded by noise. Social development also followed these patterns. The constant presence of others required negotiation, patience, and shared understanding. Disputes, play, and cooperation occurred within the same confined space. Children learned to live in close quarters without personal isolation, mastering the art of coexistence. Individual desires were subordinated to group needs, and privacy, whether for thought or action, became a luxury virtually inaccessible to them. The ambient noise of underground living also shaped imagination. Stories, songs, and oral traditions were recited aloud to compete with the constant background sounds. Children learned to focus on voice and narrative rather than visual cues. The rhythm, tone, and repetition of spoken words became central to memory and cultural transmission. In darkness and constant activity, children relied on sound to interpret the world, learning to listen as a primary means of understanding. Even playtime carried lessons in caution and awareness. Running, jumping, or throwing objects recklessly could injure both child and sibling. The confined environment demanded mindfulness and dexterity. Games were often cooperative rather than competitive, designed to teach attention, patience, and balance. Laughter was present, but it was tempered by an acute awareness of the limitations of space. Noise could not be unbounded, nor could activity escape the physical constraints of the underground home. The persistent activity of adults, combined with the presence of animals, ensured that the children's environment was never static. Sounds and movements flowed constantly, creating a world where attention had to be divided between multiple sources. Listening, observing, and responding became essential skills, shaping not only survival instincts, but also cognitive and emotional development. A child's ability to navigate the world above ground, rarely quiet itself, was honed in these subterranean, noisy classrooms. Over time, children internalized the rhythms of the home. They learned to predict the patterns of daily life, when meals would be prepared, when fire embers needed tending, when animals would shift and make noise. These internal maps of sound and movement allowed them to function effectively. Despite the absence of quiet, they developed a keen sense of timing, anticipation, and coordination. Despite the absence of literal quiet, children found fleeting moments of solace. These moments were often internal daydreams, whispered imaginings, or mental retreats during work or play. Physical stillness did not guarantee silence, but mental quiet became a tool for resilience. Children learned to retreat inwardly when external calm was impossible, cultivating a sense of private thought even within the confines of communal life. By the time they reached adolescence, children of underground homes had mastered a form of multitasking unknown to surface dwellers. They could work, observe, listen, and respond simultaneously, all while navigating cramped, noisy spaces. Skills of attention, memory, and adaptation were heightened. Yet even mastery of these skills could not grant the simple pleasure of a quiet home. Silence remained an imagined, fleeting luxury, not a lived reality. The world outside these homes, with its occasional expanses of quiet and open air, contrasted sharply with underground life. But most children rarely experienced it. Fields, roads, and forest edges offered freedom, but the need for protection and warmth kept families rooted below. The underground dwelling, though harsh and unrelenting, became the totality of childhood experience. Sound, movement, and proximity defined life as much as walls and ceilings. And so, children grew up not knowing the comfort of quiet, yet learning resilience, vigilance, and awareness. They understood instinctively that life was active, shared, and demanding, where the cost of comfort was survival itself. Each breath drawn in these close, lively spaces was a lesson in endurance, and every shadow, shuffle, and whisper became part of the foundation on which they would build adulthood. Faith, routine, and endurance beneath the soil. Beneath the soil, faith was more than a spiritual practice. It was a lifeline. For medieval peasants living in underground homes, the days were long, dark, and unyielding, marked by physical hardship and constant vigilance. The walls of earth, though protective against wind, rain, and invading forces, also confined families to a world of limited light and constrained space. In such conditions, routine and belief were not luxuries. They were essential tools for psychological and emotional endurance. Faith provided structure, while daily habits offered predictability in a life otherwise dominated by uncertainty. Each day began with small rituals, rooted in both religion and practical survival. Before the fire was fully stoked, a mother might whisper a prayer over the embers, asking for warmth, protection, or sustenance. Fathers and older children joined in their own quiet petitions, forming an unspoken chorus that filled the underground space. These prayers were not formal ceremonies, but habitual acknowledgments of dependence on forces beyond human control. In a home where disease, dampness, and scarcity were constant companions, such rituals offered reassurance and a sense of purpose. The repetition of routine became a stabilizing force. Tasks were divided according to age, strength, and experience. Children swept and replaced straw bedding, tended small fires, or fed animals, while adults prepared meals, repaired walls, and managed stores of grain and water. The cycles of labor were predictable, allowing families to anticipate needs and conserve energy. Even in darkness, each person knew their role. Routine created a rhythm, a heartbeat that transformed the underground home from a place of confinement into a functioning world. Faith and routine were intertwined. Daily prayers were synchronized with chores and meals, providing temporal markers in the absence of clocks or sunlight. Morning prayers coincided with the first stirring of the fire. Midday reflections accompanied the preparation of meals. Evening petitions coincided with final rounds to check animals and extinguish unnecessary flames. These practices helped structure the day, giving every action a rhythm, a reason, and a temporal anchor. For children especially, such predictability provided security in a world where the line between life and death was often fragile. Both physical and mental was cultivated through this structure. Life underground demanded constant adaptation to discomfort: damp floors, low ceilings, limited air circulation, and the ever-present smoke from hearths. Bodies were pushed to perform under constrained conditions. And yet, the routines created a sense of mastery over the environment. Repetition reinforced competence. One learned where to place bedding for warmth, how to stoke fires without creating suffocating smoke, when to feed animals for maximum efficiency. Endurance was not merely about survival. It was about living efficiently and predictably within a world that offered few certainties. Faith also shaped moral and emotional life. Religious instruction, whether passed down orally or through observation of rituals, emphasized patience, humility, and perseverance. Suffering was framed as a test of character or as part of a divine plan. This interpretation did not reduce the physical challenges of underground life, but offered a framework for understanding them. The damp walls, the constant labor, the proximity to disease and defall became bearable because they were interpreted through the lens of faith. Pain and discomfort were not meaningless. They were experiences with spiritual significance. Community and shared belief extended beyond the immediate household. Families in proximity often shared knowledge of prayers, rituals, and practical routines. Certain saints, blessings, or charms were favored for protection against sickness or misfortune. Even though homes were subterranean and relatively isolated, faith created a broader network of invisible support, connecting households to a wider cultural and spiritual world. These shared beliefs reinforced the idea that survival was not merely an individual or familial endeavor, it was part of a continuum sustained by divine providence and human diligence alike. Children, immersed from birth in this fusion of faith and routine, internalized these lessons deeply. They learned to measure time not by sun or clock, but by the sequence of chores and prayers. They understood suffering as natural, hardships as instructive, and daily labor as sacred in its own way. This education, though unstructured in the formal sense, was rigorous in its emotional and psychological effects. Children grew up resilient, capable of operating within extreme conditions, and attuned to the rhythms of both human and divine expectation. The physical environment reinforced these spiritual lessons. The low ceilings, uneven floors, and dark corners demanded careful movement and constant awareness. Every task was intensified by spatial constraints. Water had to be carried cautiously, fire tended vigilantly, animals fed with precision. These challenges, combined with ritualized practices, instilled a sense of discipline and focus. Endurance was built not only in response to hardship, but also as a conscious practice, supported by faith and reinforced through repetition. Even in moments of crisis, routine and faith provided stability. During storms or times of scarcity, families turned instinctively to established practices, prayers whispered over embers, careful rationing of food, rotation of labor among members, and meticulous tending of animals. The predictability of these actions contrasted with the chaos outside, while the world above ground could erupt unpredictably through disease, weather, or raids. The subterranean home offered a controlled, organized environment where survival depended on disciplined action. Over years and generations, this rhythm became internalized. Adults acted without conscious thought of each step. Children absorbed lessons in endurance by observation, and households functioned as cohesive units. Faith reinforced routine, providing moral and spiritual justification for the endless repetition of tasks. Endurance, therefore, was both a physical capacity and a cultivated virtue, nurtured through experience, ritual, and careful observation of the world underground. Even joy and celebration were incorporated into this framework. Religious feasts, saints' days, and communal prayers were occasions that marked special moments, but they were never separate from survival. Preparations for these events were labor-intensive, requiring careful timing and collaboration, yet they infused life with meaning beyond the mere mechanics of enduring hardship. In this way, faith and routine intertwined with both survival and the human need for narrative, marking life as purposeful even beneath the soil. The underground space itself became a teacher. Its limitations enforced discipline, while its shelter provided security. Walls, damp and confining, shaped the mind as well as the body. Every action, from tending fires to mending walls, was a lesson in persistence. Faith added interpretive depth, suggesting that these struggles were not accidental but part of a larger design. Together, they forged a household culture defined by diligence and a quiet resilience that could not be measured solely by physical survival. Even in extreme conditions, the integration of faith and routine offered psychological reprieve. When illness struck or supplies dwindled, structured practices carefully timed Chores provided a sense of control and stability. The predictability of these actions offered comfort, reducing anxiety and reinforcing communal cohesion. Endurance was supported not only by body and environment, but also by mind and spirit, demonstrating the interdependence of physical, emotional, and spiritual well-being. Through this framework, families survive not merely existing, but adapting, thriving within the constraints of their environment. Children grew into adults who could navigate darkness, damp, disease, and labor with skill and composure. Life beneath the soil demanded relentless attention, yet faith and routine transformed that demand into a structured existence. Endurance became both habit and identity, shaping not only the physical but also the moral and psychological contours of each individual and household. And so, beneath the low ceilings and earthen walls, amidst smoke, animals, and the persistent chill, life persisted. Faith provided meaning, routine provided order, and endurance became the currency of existence. In this subterranean world, where uncertainty and hardship were constants, families discovered resilience, adapted through generations, and cultivated a depth of strength that would define their lives long after the echoes of footsteps, prayers, and whispered routines faded into the dark soil. What archaeology reveals about these forgotten spaces beneath modern landscapes, hidden beneath centuries of change. Archaeology has begun to illuminate the underground lives of medieval peasants' lives that were otherwise lost to time. The soil, which once sheltered families from wind, rain, and violence, now preserves traces of daily existence, remnants of walls, scorched hearths, scattered pottery, and tools worn smooth by constant labor. These discoveries reveal not only the physical structures of subterranean homes, but also the intimate, challenging, and resilient nature of the lives lived within them. Every fragment tells a story of adaptation, endurance, and human ingenuity. Excavations of these underground dwellings often reveal the meticulous care with which peasants carved space from the earth. Unlike the grand stone castles and cathedrals that dominate historical imagination, these homes were modest, functional, and laboriously crafted. Archaeologists find low ceilings, roughly hewn walls, and compact rooms that reflect careful planning within severe spatial constraints. Each structure is a testament to the determination to survive, balancing the need for shelter with the practical limitations of digging through earth and stone without advanced tools. Hearths are among the most telling features uncovered. Burnt stones and layers of ash indicate the centrality of fire, not only for warmth and cooking, but as the focal point around which life was organized. Analysis of soot deposits and charred food remnants allows archaeologists to reconstruct daily routines. The types of food consumed, the fuel used, and even the ways families coped with the persistent challenge of smoke in low-ceilinged spaces. These traces illustrate the careful negotiation between comfort, health, and survival, highlighting the ingenuity of families forced to make do with limited resources. Pottery fragments, often discarded or broken in the course of daily life, reveal both practicality and social habit. Bowls, cups, and storage vessels indicate the kinds of meals prepared, portion sizes, and food storage strategies. Some vessels bear evidence of repeated repair, demonstrating a resourcefulness born from necessity. Archaeology shows that these families value durability over aesthetics. Yet even within their limitations, there is evidence of care, personalization, and continuity. Patterns that suggest pride and attention to household order. Animal remains found within these spaces, speak volumes about the interdependence of humans and animals in underground life. Bones, dung, and traces of bedding confirm that livestock often lived in close quarters with families, providing warmth, food, and labor. Archaeologists can identify species, diets, and even signs of disease, allowing a reconstruction of how cohabitation shaped both human and animal existence. These findings emphasize that warmth, nutrition, and survival were communal efforts, extending beyond human boundaries into the animal world. Evidence of disease and health challenges is also preserved in the soil and skeletal remains. Osteological studies reveal signs of malnutrition, repetitive labor, respiratory stress, and infections common in damp, crowded environments. Children's bones often bear marks of early stress and stunted growth, while adult skeletons reflect wear from constant labor. These physical records corroborate historical accounts of underground living, confirming that survival demanded both endurance and compromise, often at the cost of health and longevity. Artifacts of daily labor tools, weaving implements, cooking utensils, and storage containers show the ingenuity required to make life manageable underground. Every implement was multi-purpose, carefully maintained, and often adapted over time. For example, simple wooden tools bear marks of repair, indicating that nothing was discarded lightly. Archaeologists can trace patterns of use that suggest routines, when and how meals were prepared, how bedding was arranged, how walls were maintained. These findings create a detailed picture of a life defined by practical problem-solving and constant adaptation. Even the spatial organization of these dwellings, revealed through careful excavation, offers insight into family dynamics and survival strategies. Sleeping areas, workspaces, and animal enclosures were tightly integrated, reflecting a deliberate balancing of warmth, hygiene, and accessibility. Narrow tunnels or low partitions allowed movement while conserving heat, while the placement of hearths, storage pits, and sleeping platforms demonstrates an intuitive understanding of spatial efficiency. Archaeology confirms that these homes were not haphazard. They were carefully engineered to support life under difficult circumstances. The stratigraphy of these underground spaces, the layers of soil, ash, and debris accumulated over time, tells a story of continuity and change. Houses were maintained, repaired, expanded, or abandoned as families adapted to shifting conditions. Evidence of repeated construction efforts reveals that these homes were long-term investments, not temporary shelters. This contradicts earlier historical assumptions that such dwellings were makeshift or transitory, highlighting, instead, a deliberate, enduring engagement with the subterranean environment. In addition to structural and material evidence, archaeologists uncover traces of culture and belief. Small figurines, carved symbols, and religious artifacts occasionally appear within these homes. These items suggest that faith remained central even in confined, labor-intensive environments. Rituals were conducted quietly, perhaps at hearthside or in private corners, reflecting the fusion of practicality and spiritual life. Such finds reinforce the historical narrative that survival underground was not only physical, but also moral and emotional, supported by ritualized practices and shared beliefs. The analysis of refuse layers, discarded food, broken tools, and wastalso provides insights into diet, hygiene, and social hierarchy within the household. Archaeologists can determine what was consumed, what was preserved, and what was considered expendable. patterns of waste indicate not only scarcity, but also resource. For example, bones might be repurposed for tools or crafts, broken pottery repaired or reused, and food scraps fed to animals. Such findings illustrate a lifestyle governed by frugality, foresight, and the constant negotiation between necessity and scarcity. Archaeology also reveals evidence of environmental challenges. Signs of water seepage, mold, and structural collapse illustrate the ongoing struggle against damp walls and unstable soil. Repairs and adaptations, such as raised sleeping platforms or stone reinforcements, show the proactive measures families took to mitigate environmental hazards. Even small details, like channels for ventilation or drainage, indicate sophisticated understanding of underground living. These technical adaptations are testament to human ingenuity and a deep empirical knowledge of the subterranean environment. The study of these spaces extends to social organization as well. The size, complexity, and location of homes suggest patterns of family structure, labor division, and community networks. Larger homes may indicate extended families living together, while smaller spaces reflect nuclear units or temporary shelter. Analysis of multiple sites within a region reveals clusters of habitation, showing how underground life was embedded within broader rural networks. Archaeology thus bridges the material with the social, allowing historians to reconstruct patterns of medieval rural life beyond surface-level accounts. Inscriptions and graffiti, rarely preserved, occasionally emerge in these excavations. Carvings of initials, dates, or simple images suggest moments of self-expression amidst the constraints of subterranean living. Though limited, such traces humanize the occupants, reminding us that these were not anonymous laborers, but individuals with thoughts, desires, and identities. Archaeology transforms the abstract into the tangible, giving voice to those who lived in the shadows of history. The cumulative evidence also challenges modern assumptions about the past. While history often emphasizes castles, cities, and elites, the material record shows that underground homes were both common and highly adaptive. They reveal resilience, ingenuity, and a sophisticated understanding of environmental management. Archaeology demonstrates that these forgotten spaces were not merely survivalist refuge. They were dynamic, functional, and culturally meaningful environments that supported life in difficult conditions. Even the smallest finds a broken spindle, a fragment of pottery, a scorched bone become windows into daily existence. When considered collectively, they reveal the rhythms, struggles, and adaptations of life beneath the soil. The patterns of use, repair, and maintenance illuminate the extraordinary measures peasants took to create livable spaces, to nurture families, and to endure generations of hardship. Finally, the study of these underground homes reminds us of the fragility and resilience of human life. Though hidden, damp, and constrained, these spaces were home. They nurtured children, sustained families, and preserved a culture of endurance, labor, and faith. Archaeology does more than uncover walls or tools. It reconstructs a lived experience, allowing modern observers to grasp the ingenuity, sacrifice, and persistence required to survive in a world that was often hostile and unforgiving. Through careful excavation, analysis, and interpretation, these forgotten spaces speak to us across the centuries. They tell a story not of grandeur, but of resilience, not of comfort, but of resourcefulness, not of spectacle, but of the quiet courage required to endure. The subterranean homes of medieval peasants. Why these homes slowly disappeared from history. The underground homes of medieval peasants, once essential havens of survival, did not vanish overnight. Their disappearance was a gradual process, shaped by a combination of social, economic, technological, and environmental changes that slowly rendered subterranean living unnecessary or, at least, less advantageous. For centuries, these homes had sheltered families from harsh weather, protected them from theft and violence, and concentrated warmth and resources in confined spaces. Yet, as the medieval world evolved, the very factors that had made underground life vital began to shift, and with them, the spaces themselves began to fade from memory and practice. One of the primary forces driving this change was the improvement of above-ground building techniques. As timber framing, bricklaying, and stone masonry became more accessible and widespread, surface dwellings grew more durable, comfortable, and insulated. Families could now construct homes that resisted wind and rain without retreating into the earth. Walls could be built thicker, roofs sturdier, and chimneys installed to manage smoke from indoor fires. With these innovations, the practical necessity of living underground protection from the elements was reduced. Above-ground homes offered light, air, and more space, improving daily life and reducing some of the health hazards associated with subterranean living, such as dampness, poor ventilation, and the spread of disease. Economic changes also contributed to the gradual disappearance of underground homes. As trade networks expanded, food supplies became somewhat more reliable, and the need to store livestock and provisions in confined spaces diminished. Markets offered opportunities to acquire goods that previously had to be produced and preserved on site, while wealth accumulation allowed for investment in larger, above-ground dwellings. Families who could afford it sought homes that offered more comfort and social status, leaving behind the cramped, dark, and often malodorous underground spaces of previous generations. Survival remained difficult, but survival no longer required the extreme compromises imposed by life beneath the soil. Social transformation played a crucial role as well. Communities evolved, and with increased population density and the consolidation of villages, underground homes became less socially acceptable. As people began to value above-ground appearance and cleanliness, subterranean dwellings were increasingly associated with poverty, backwardness, or social marginalization. The architectural forms that had once represented ingenuity and adaptation were reinterpreted as relics of a less civilized past. Families seeking to maintain social standing were motivated to abandon these homes in favor of structures that signaled status, stability, and conformity to emerging social norms. Political and legal developments also influenced the decline. Land ownership and property laws became more structured, often favoring permanent, documented dwellings above ground. Peasants' underground homes, carved informally into soil or hillside, were difficult to register, tax, or defend legally, as authorities enforced regulations regarding property boundaries, building codes, or taxation. Subterranean residences became increasingly precarious. Some families were compelled to abandon these homes for fear of fines, confiscation, or eviction, accelerating the disappearance of these spaces from both the landscape and the historical record. Technological advances in heating and ventilation further reduced the necessity of underground living. The development of more efficient fireplaces, chimneys, and stoves allowed warmth to be maintained in above-ground homes without the proximity of animals or reliance on thick earth walls. Smoke could be expelled safely, reducing respiratory hazards, while interior spaces could remain drier and more habitable year. The comfort provided by these innovations made life underground less appealing, as the risks associated with dampness, overcrowding, and poor air quality could now be mitigated above ground. Changing attitudes toward health also contributed to the abandonment of subterranean homes. The association between damp, dark spaces and disease became more widely recognized, even if only empirically. Families gradually understood that long-term exposure to moisture, poor ventilation, and cohabitation with livestock increased the likelihood of respiratory illness, infections, and parasitic infestations. While necessity had once outweighed these concerns, improved options above ground meant that health considerations could now influence architectural choices. Life could be sustained more safely without remaining buried beneath the earth. Environmental changes, too, played a part. Shifts in land use, deforestation, agriculture, and drainage altered the landscapes surrounding subterranean dwellings. Previously stable hillsides or soil banks became less suitable for excavation, or the water table shifted, increasing the risk of flooding and collapse. As communities expanded, underground spaces were sometimes destroyed to make way for roads, cultivated land, or larger buildings. Natural forces that had once been mitigated by earth walls now made these homes less practical, and families gradually relocated to safer, more sustainable above-ground structures. Cultural memory contributed to their erasure. Underground homes were functional, not monumental. They left little mark in written records or public imagination, overshadowed by the castles, churches, and urban centers that historians and chroniclers preferred to describe. As new generations moved into above-ground homes, knowledge of how to construct and maintain subterranean spaces faded. Skills that had been taught orally, digging, reinforcing walls, managing smoke, and arranging animals for warmth were no longer transmitted. In this way, both practice and memory of underground living were gradually lost, leaving only traces in archaeology and rare anecdotal accounts. Religious and moral perceptions also influenced this shift. Life underground, associated with darkness, dirt, and the close proximity of animals, could be perceived as morally or spiritually suspect. Above-ground homes, with access to light, cleanliness, and organized domestic space, were more closely aligned with evolving notions of order, propriety, and decency. Religious authorities, moral commentators, and social reformers increasingly praised structured, above-ground domesticity, while discouraging or ignoring subterranean alternatives. In this climate, the underground home slowly fell out of favor, disappearing from communal life and social approval alike. Migration patterns amplified the effect. As rural families moved to towns or more fertile lands, they often abandoned old underground homes. Urbanization required above-ground construction, while opportunities for trade, employment, and social mobility incentivized above-ground dwelling. Rural depopulation, in some regions, further diminished the necessity for subterranean adaptation, leaving these homes to collapse or be reclaimed by nature. In regions where economic and social structures shifted rapidly, the physical traces of underground homes decayed faster than they could be maintained in some cases. Political conflict and warfare hastened the decline. During periods of conquest or civil unrest, underground homes, often poorly fortified compared to stone or brick buildings, were vulnerable to collapse, destruction, or abandonment. Families seeking safety migrated to villages or fortified towns, leaving behind spaces that were once vital for survival. Over time, repeated cycles of abandonment and decay erased these homes from the living landscape. Archaeological research confirms that these shifts occurred unevenly across regions. In some isolated areas, subterranean dwellings persisted longer, sometimes into the early modern period, sustained by necessity or tradition. In other areas, particularly near growing towns, they disappeared rapidly as social, technological, and economic changes converged. The pattern is one of gradual attrition rather than sudden disappearance, reflecting a slow but inexorable reconfiguration of domestic life. Ultimately, the disappearance of underground homes was a result of human ingenuity meeting new opportunity. Just as these spaces had once represented adaptation, resilience, and creativity, their abandonment demonstrates the same qualities in reverse. Families moved toward environments that offered greater comfort, safety, and social alignment. The subterranean home, once vital, became redundant, leaving only traces of its existence in archaeology, folklore, and occasional written mention. And yet, despite their erasure from daily life, these homes left an enduring legacy. They remind us of a period when survival demanded extraordinary adaptation, when families labored beneath soil and stone to sustain life, and when the boundaries between humans, animals, and the earth were negotiated with care and skill. Their slow disappearance from history is not a story of failure, but of evolution. As conditions changed, humans abandoned one form of ingenuity in favor of another, leaving behind a subterranean world now silent, yet deeply resonant with the struggles and endurance of those who once called it home. Remembering a life that was never meant to be comfortable, as we reflect on the underground homes of medieval peasants, it becomes clear that these spaces were never designed for comfort. The very notion of ease, as we understand it today, would have been alien to their creators and inhabitants. Life beneath the soil was defined by survival, endurance, and adaptation. Warmth was borrowed from animals, moisture seeped relentlessly through walls, and light was a rare and precious commodity. Yet within these harsh conditions, families forged a life, small, intimate, and persistent. Remembering this life is not about romanticizing hardship, but about honoring resilience, ingenuity, and the human capacity to endure. Every detail of these homes tells a story of compromise. Walls were dug with hands and rudimentary tools, floors layered with straw to cushion the dampness, and ceilings kept low to conserve heat. Space was shared relentlessly. Adults slept alongside children. Animals nestled in corners to provide warmth, and daily tasks, cooking, mending, tending, occurred in close quarters. Privacy was fleeting, quiet, almost non-existent. Yet, families adapted, learning to coexist, to negotiate space and attention, and to find small measures of dignity in shared survival. Children, growing up entirely within these subterranean confines, never knew a quiet home in the way we understand it. Their earliest memories were of breath, movement, and sound. The crackling of fire, the shuffle of straw, the low bleat of livestock, and the constant murmur of parents and siblings. Even sleep offered no true escape from life's demands. Rest was measured against the rhythm of others, breathing, coughing, and shifting. And yet, through this cacophony, children absorbed invaluable lessons: attentiveness, adaptability, and the subtle navigation of human relationships within constrained space. They learned endurance, not as theory, but as a lived, embodied reality. Faith and routine provided structure amidst chaos. Prayers whispered over hearths, repeated daily rituals, and synchronized chores imbued life with rhythm and meaning. The repetition of tasks: stoking fires, feeding animals, repairing walls, and preparing meals was not monotony, but a carefully calibrated system that balanced labor, survival, and spiritual sustenance. endurance became a cultivated virtue, supported by both the tangible benefits of routine and the invisible reassurance of belief. Life underground was harsh, but not senseless. Every action had purpose, every struggle a context within a broader framework of survival and hope. Archaeology now allows us to glimpse these lives with clarity and depth. Fragments of pottery, scorched hearthstones, worn tools, and animal remains reveal the daily rhythms of families long vanished. These artifacts attest to resilience and ingenuity, how meals were prepared, fires maintained, walls reinforced, and animals cared for. Skeletal remains tell a story of repeated strain, childhood stress, and chronic labor, but also of survival and adaptation. These findings bridge centuries, giving voice to lives that historical texts often overlooked, reminding us that human experience is preserved not only in monuments, but in the subtle, enduring traces of daily living. The decline and eventual disappearance of underground homes underscores their historical specificity. As above-ground building techniques improved, economic stability increased, and social norms evolved. The subterranean home lost its necessity. Families abandoned these cramped, damp spaces in favor of light, space, and comfort above ground. Yet, while the physical structures vanished, the lessons embedded in them did not. They endure in archaeology, folklore, and historical memory, reflecting the human capacity to innovate, adapt, and survive under extreme conditions. Ultimately, remembering these lives invites us to confront a fundamental truth. Human existence is not always defined by comfort or convenience, but by the ability to endure, adapt, and create meaning in the face of hardship. The subterranean homes of medieval peasants, though far removed from modern notions of domestic ease, exemplify this principle. Life underground demanded ingenuity, cooperation, and resilience, and in return it provided shelter, warmth, and the continuity of generations. As we imagine these households' parents, tending fires while children sleep nearby, animals pressing close for warmth, the smell of earth mingling with smoke and sweat, we recognize a profound lesson about human existence. Comfort is transient. Survival requires vigilance, creativity, and shared effort. Yet even in the most challenging circumstances, humans find ways to nurture, to care, and to persist. There is dignity in endurance, even when it is unseen and The story of these subterranean dwellings concludes not with the triumph of comfort, but with the quiet resilience of those who lived without it. Their lives were not designed for ease. They were designed for survival, and in remembering them, we honor the persistence of families who, beneath the weight of earth and hardship, carved out a space to live, grow, and endure. Their legacy reminds us that history is not only written in monuments and chronicles, but in the unseen, unglamorous, yet profoundly human spaces where ordinary people persevered against extraordinary odds. And so, the underground homes of medieval peasants, once bustling with life, activity, and resilience, may have disappeared from the surface of the earth, but they remain immortal in memory, archaeology, and human imagination. A life never meant to be comfortable, yet enduring, creative, and profoundly human, stands as a testament to the indomitable spirit of those who lived beneath the soil. The end